Ja, schönen guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Ich freue mich natürlich, dass so viele gekommen sind heute Abend. Aber Sie haben alle hier Platz gefunden. Wir müssen das nicht parallel in einen anderen Hörsaal übertragen. Das freut mich schon mal. Also, dies ist ein ganz besonderer Abend in unserer Reihe über Redefreiheit. Nicht nur, weil wir einen sehr außergewöhnlichen Gast haben, was auch schon der rege Zulauf zeigt, sondern weil auch der heutige Vortrag eine ganz eigene Vorgeschichte hat. Zu der werde ich gleich noch etwas ausführlicher Stellung nehmen. Diese kurze Einführung wird komplett auf Deutsch sein, weil erfreulicherweise Peter Singer ganz gut Deutsch versteht, allerdings seinen Vortrag selbst nicht auf Deutsch halten kann. Aber ich habe eben mit ihm gesprochen, er wird sehr gerne nachher Fragen auf Deutsch, sofern er folgen kann, auch annehmen und sie dann auf Englisch beantworten. Und möglicherweise gibt es auch noch ein bisschen Bedarf, das zu übersetzen, aber das werden wir irgendwie hinbekommen. Peter Singer, einige Worte zu seiner Biografie und dem Hintergrund. Peter Singer ist derzeit De Camp Professor of Bioethics am University Center for Human Values der Princeton University an der School of Historical and Philosophical Studies. Jetzt habe ich mich verhaspelt. Es ist so viel, dass ich die Titel gar nicht ordentlich genannt bekomme. Also er ist Professor of Bioethics am University Center for Human Values der Princeton University und zugleich Laureate Professor an der School of Historical and Philosophical Studies in Melbourne, Australien. Bereits 2005 wurde er vom Time Magazine zu den 100 einflussreichsten Menschen der Erde gezählt und das Duttweiler-Institut hat ihn in den letzten Jahren wiederholt zu einem der wichtigsten Global Thought Leader gekürt. Von seinen zahlreichen Schriften, die in unzählige Sprachen übersetzt wurden, möchte ich vielleicht nur die 4 wichtigsten nennen. In seinem auch angesichts der gegenwärtigen Flüchtlingskrise immer noch hochaktuellen und inzwischen auch als Buch erhältlichen Aufsatz Hunger, Wohlstand und Moral von 1972 zeigt Singer mit großer Klarheit, dass Bürger der westlichen Welt angesichts massiven Hungers und Leidens in anderen Teilen der Welt die moralische Pflicht haben, einen signifikanten Teil ihres Wohlstandes einzusetzen, um dieses Leiden zu vermindern. Sein Buch Animal Liberation von 1975 ist mit seiner Argumentation gegen den Speziesismus eines der Gründungsdokumente der modernen Tierethik. Practical Ethics von 1979 ist eines der wichtigsten und einflussreichsten Bücher zu Fragen der Sterbehilfe und Abtreibung in der Bioethik. Mit seinem Buch The Most Good You Can Do, How Effective Altruism is Changing Ideas About Living Ethically von 2015 hat Singer schließlich die inzwischen weltumspannende Bewegung des effektiven Altruismus mitbegründet. Ausschnitte aus diesen Schriften kennen nicht nur Philosophiestudierende, die natürlich auch, sondern inzwischen auch fast jede Schülerin und jeder Schüler. Singer hat seine Arbeit nicht nur den zentralen Themen Tierethik, Bioethik und effektiver Altruismus gewidmet, sondern auch Bücher zu Marx und Hegel geschrieben. Ich glaube, das Marx-Buch ist gerade in der 2. Auflage neu erschienen, sowie politische und historische Themen behandelt. Zum Beispiel in seinem Buch zur Ethik von George W. Bush oder in seinem sehr persönlichen Buch zum Schicksal seines Großvaters David Oppenheim, der Opfer des Holocausts in Theresienstadt wurde. Gestatten Sie mir, dass ich die vielen Ehrungen, Auszeichnungen und Ehrenämter, die Singer über die Jahre erhalten hat und ausgeübt hat, hier aus Zeitgründen unerwähnt lasse. Peter Singer ist ein philosophischer Denker, für den die Ethik keine nur rein akademische Angelegenheit ist. Keine rein akademische Angelegenheit im Elfenbeinturm. Einer seiner wichtigsten Kernsätze lautet, wer seine eigenen Schlussfolgerungen wirklich ernst nimmt, der muss auch entsprechend handeln. Singer möchte die Welt zu einem besseren Ort machen, einem Ort, an dem es weniger Leiden, weniger Hunger, weniger Armut und weniger Krankheiten gibt, sowohl für menschliche als auch für nichtmenschliche Lebewesen. An diesem Projekt kann und sollte nach Singer jeder von uns auf seine Weise mitwirken und die Verbesserung der Welt nicht nur den Politikern überlassen. Er selbst tut dies seit Jahrzehnten unter größten, ja allergrößten persönlichen Einsatz. Ein eindrucksvolles Beispiel ist die Gründung der Organisation The Life You Can Save, einer Meta-Hilfsorganisation, wenn man so will, die einem dabei hilft, den für einen persönlich besten Weg zu finden, sich für das Wohl anderer einzusetzen. Peter Singers Leben und Wirken beweisen auf vielfache Weise, dass philosophisches Denken die Welt verändern kann und wie nachhaltig diese Veränderungen sein können. Wer allerdings wie Singer die Grenzen des Erlaubten und Gebotenen im Denken neu vermisst und dabei auch gewohnte Grenzen überschreitet, der erntet nicht nur Zustimmung, sondern muss zwangsläufig auch Widerspruch begegnen. Das hat er mit seinen Thesen zur aktiven Sterbehilfe bei schwerstleidenden Kleinkindern und zur Abtreibung vielfach erfahren. Dabei sind meines Erachtens kontroverse Debatten in der Ethik gerade zu den zentralen Fragen von Leben und Tod von unschätzbarem Wert für die Allgemeinheit. Zumindest solange sie redlich und mit rationalen Argumenten geführt werden. Und das hat Singer auf vorbildliche Weise in seinen Schriften getan. Er argumentiert klar, konsequent und kompromisslos. Immer im sachlich nüchternen Stil, häufig mit genauso starken wie überraschend einfachen Argumenten. Das Fundament seiner Überlegungen ist und bleibt dabei der Utilitarismus. In Kontroversen dieser Art kann man natürlich Positionen wie die von Singer für falsch halten und das auch ganz klar zum Ausdruck bringen. Man sollte diese Positionen aber dennoch aushalten, und zwar auch dann, wenn sie einem ganz falsch erscheinen oder sogar in einem gewissen Sinne verstören. Der rationale Diskurs lebt nämlich davon, dass die Gegenseite nicht einfach zum Schweigen gebracht wird. Die akademische Freiheit ist gerade hier von unschätzbarem Wert, wenn wir die Ethik nicht einfach Tabus, Denkverboten oder Weltanschauungen überlassen oder zu einer reinen Sache der Religion erklären wollen. Die Erfahrungen, die Singer während der letzten 30 Jahre in Deutschland gemacht hat, waren leider häufig andere. Im Nachwort zur zweiten Auflage seines Buches Praktische Ethik berichtet Singer über die verstörenden Vorfälle bei seinen Vorträgen Anfang der 90er Jahre in Deutschland, Österreich und der Schweiz. Viele der bereits angekündigten Vorträge zur Bioethik wurden durch Störer massiv behindert, ganz gesprengt oder bereits vorab abgeblasen. Es herrschte ein Klima der Einschüchterung und der Intoleranz und es wurde versucht, Singer auf jede nur mögliche Weise zum Schweigen zu bringen oder mundtot zu machen. Auch Intellektuelle sprachen in diesem Zusammenhang von einem Dammbruch im Denken, den es zu verhindern gelte, und davon, dass Singer eben absolut indiskutable oder wenigstens öffentlich nicht diskutierbare Positionen vertrete. Nur wenige setzten sich öffentlich dafür ein, dass Singer den Raum dafür bekam, seine Position zu vertreten, und zwar selbst dann, wenn man sie nicht teilt oder sogar vehement ablehnt. Die Ausgrenzung ging dabei so weit, dass man Singer persönlich diffamierte und ihn wegen seiner Position zur Sterbehilfe eine geistige Nähe zum Nationalsozialismus unterstellte. Dabei stellte sich dann oft schnell heraus, dass die Gegner Singers Schriften gar nicht aus eigener Lektüre kannten und auch nicht wussten, dass seine eigene Familie zum Opfer des Holocausts geworden war. Man könnte nun denken, dass solche Zeiten lange vorbei sind. Wenigstens dachte ich das, bis Singer 2015 von der Phil Cologne zu einem Vortrag über Tierethik eingeladen wurde und dann, als er sich in einem Interview der Neuen Zürcher Zeitung zu Fragen der aktiven Sterbehilfe äußerte, überraschend kurzerhand wieder ausgeladen wurde. Die Veranstalter verwiesen in ihrer Begründung auf die moralisch indiskutablen Thesen Singers, aber auch auf die Gefährdungssituation, die eine öffentliche Diskussion mit Singer heraufbeschwören würde. Ich empfand diesen Vorgang damals nicht nur als respektlos gegenüber Singer, sondern auch als eine massive Verletzung der akademischen Freiheit. Deshalb gab es einen von mir initiierten öffentlichen Protestbrief, den 22 namhafte deutsche Philosophinnen und Philosophen mit unterzeichnet haben. Zugleich entstand in dieser Zeit jedoch auch der Plan, mit Singer über genau dieses Thema der akademischen Redefreiheit öffentlich in Köln zu diskutieren. Und wenn Sie so wollen, ist der heutige Abend nun das Ergebnis davon. Es hat wegen vieler Terminschwierigkeiten etwas länger gedauert, aber nun ist Peter Singer endlich zu Gast bei uns in Köln. Lassen Sie mich zum Schluss noch eines betonen. In emotional aufgeladenen Fragen von Leben und Tod ist es sicher nicht immer leicht für die direkt oder auch indirekt Betroffenen, grenzüberschreitende Debatten, in denen vieles zur Diskussion steht, auszuhalten. Ich sehe diesen Abend aber auch als eine große Chance für alle Beteiligten, über die Reichweite und die möglichen Grenzen akademischer Redefreiheit mit Peter Singer in eine sachliche und vorurteilsfreie Debatte einzutreten. Ich denke, davon können wir alle nur lernen. Das kann aber nur gelingen, wenn wir uns an diesem Abend für alle gemeinsam konsequent an die Spielregeln einer solchen sachlich und fair geführten Debatte halten. Und ich hoffe, das wird auch so sein. In diesem Sinne jetzt Bühne frei für Peter Singer. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. Thank you, Professor Grundmann, for the invitation to come here and for having organized this event. And thank you for your very generous and informative introduction. I'm really pleased, for the reasons that you described, to be able to be here in Köln and to discuss this question of freedom of expression. Freedom of expression historically has been a cause that has been championed by the left against the right, which has sought to restrict the expression of radical ideas. I had an example of that when I was appointed to Princeton University in 1999. One of the board of trustees of the university was Steve Forbes. He was the son of Malcolm Forbes, who had been a major donor to the university, had endowed one of the university colleges, Forbes College, which was named after him. And Steve Forbes himself had been a significant donor. But he was also, at that time in 1999, seeking the Republican nomination for the presidency. As you know, he didn't succeed. It went to George W. Bush. But he suddenly found himself embarrassed by the fact that he was after the Republican nomination and he was the trustee of a university who had appointed somebody with admittedly rather radical views on abortion and euthanasia, something that, of course, the Republican Party then, as now, does not accept. So he protested against my appointment. He sought to have the Board of Trustees rescind my appointment, although the offer had already been made to me and I had accepted. He got no support, I'm pleased to say, from the Board of Trustees, and he then pledged that he would refuse to make any further donations to the university as long as I remained there. Well, I'm still there. More recently, in 2014, the University of Illinois withdrew an offer of appointment to Professor Stephen Salater on the grounds that he had sent out tweets which were critical of Israel and of Prime Minister Netanyahu. And that was clearly, again, a right-wing reaction trying to silence criticism of Israel. And just last year, the Kennedy School at Harvard University, the Kennedy School of Government, withdrew the appointment of Chelsea Manning as a visiting fellow. Chelsea Manning, you might remember, had released information about Iraq, harmful information that was critical of American military operations. So the Harvard School of Government had appointed her as a visiting fellow, and then were criticized by Mike Pompeo, who was then the director of the CIA. He's now, under Donald Trump, the Secretary of State. And as a result of Pompeo saying he would not give a lecture at the School of Government, the Harvard School of Government withdrew the appointment to Chelsea Manning. But despite these examples, at present, most of the opposition to freedom of speech, most of the activists that have restricted freedom of speech, somewhat to my surprise, and I'm sorry to say this because I consider myself part of the left, has come from the left. And I'll give you three examples from the United States. At Middlebury College in Vermont, Charles Murray, who was the co-author of the controversial book The Bell Curve, which discusses race and IQ, was invited to speak, did attend, but was shouted down and effectively prevented from speaking. And afterwards, as he and the professor who had hosted him were leaving and going towards the car, they were jostled by protesters, and the host was pushed to the ground so forcefully that she suffered some injuries as a result of that. At Berkeley, University in California, a planned event featuring the alt-right journalist Milo Yiannopoulos was cancelled after violent protests, and the university decided it could not ensure the security of the speakers or prevent damage to property. And my third example comes from outside the universities, from Google, where the employee James Damore, who was a software engineer, circulated a memo in which he argued that the reason why there were fewer women than men in his particular field, software engineering, was at least in part explained by differences between men and women in their particular talents and abilities in certain kinds of subjects. As a result of circulating that memo, Damore was fired by Google. So what should we make of these kinds of events? Should we echo the famous remark that was supposedly made by Voltaire, although I'm told that he may never have said it, that is, I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it? Or should we say that some speakers cross a line and should not be tolerated when they do cross that line? Well, there's nothing like being silenced oneself to make you think hard about these questions. And as Professor Grundmann explained in his introduction, this has happened to me here in Germany and in other German-speaking countries, in Austria and in the German-speaking part of Switzerland. These events began in 1989 when I accepted an invitation to address a conference held by the organization Lebenshilfe, an organization of parents of children with disabilities. And some people within the organization and outside it began to protest when my appointment had been announced, began circulating extracts from my book Practical Ethics, and eventually persuaded Lebenshilfe to cancel not just my invitation, but the entire conference. And that began a series of events over the next few years where I was invited to speak in Germany, but protests either prevented me speaking at all. For example, at the University of Dortmund, led to the rector instructing the professor who had invited me to withdraw the invitation, or occasions where I came to speak but could not be heard, was drowned out. And in Zurich, I had to stop lecturing when a protester leapt up onto the stage, took my glasses from my face and smashed them under his shoe. And I'm very short-sighted and not really, wouldn't be able really to read this without my glasses. The protests were against my advocacy of permitting parents to make life and death choices for their severely disabled children, or infants, I should say, and that including the option of active euthanasia in some cases. But many of my opponents who were trying to prevent me speaking were not really interested in the reasons why I was defending that view. They held instead that some things should simply not be discussed. Some things are beyond discussion, and in particular that it's impermissible to question the inviolability of human life in general, or of the right to life of disabled human beings in particular. Some values, they were saying, are so sacrosanct that they must not be challenged. The objection to my views urged by these opponents of freedom of speech were discussed, or the type of objection, were discussed more than a century earlier by John Stuart Mill in his famous essay on liberty, which defends freedom of expression as well as individual liberty. Mill begins his defense by arguing that to seek to suppress certain views is to assume infallibility in the belief that those views are wrong, and that one is able to know which views are wrong. And Mill argues that we cannot assume infallibility on any of our beliefs. And he gives a number of examples throughout history of beliefs that were held very strongly and where people who opposed them were persecuted, but which turned out to be wrong. Of course, one of the most famous of those is the idea that our planet is the center of the universe and the sun and the stars revolve around it. It's a view for which you can see there's kind of intuitive support. If you look up in the sky, it fitted with beliefs of Christendom in particular. So you could have said it's obvious that other beliefs are false, but turns out that that was the belief that was false, and we all know that now. But in addition to saying that we should not assume infallibility, Mill offered another important reason why we should not suppress opinions different from our own. Because even if in fact we are right and the other belief is false, if we do not allow people to challenge our beliefs, if we do not allow them to engage with the reasons why we hold our beliefs, then our beliefs become a kind of a dogma. They're not living beliefs anymore. They're just dead things that you're not allowed to think about. And if we want our beliefs to really be living beliefs that people not only accept but actually understand, and understand the reasons for them, then we should allow them to be questioned. And I think that's an important argument as well. Mill considers also the objection to his views that some beliefs, whether they're true or false, are indispensable to the well-being of a good society. So the idea is that irrespective of their truth or falsity, they're things that we better believe. Otherwise, the foundations of the society in which we live will crumble with bad consequences for us all. Mill responds that this objection tries to separate the usefulness of a belief from its truth. And he thinks that can't be done, and that we're no more infallible in deciding whether a belief is useful or not useful than we are in deciding whether it is true or false. And we have to be able to discuss whether it's true or false in order to decide whether it is really true or harmful. Useful or harmful. I took something like that approach on the one occasion during the years in the early 90s that I was referring to, when a fruitful discussion did take place here in Germany between me and those who'd sought to silence me. This was at the University of Saarbrücken under the auspices of Professor Georg Megler. The event was announced, the invitation was not withdrawn. I turned up to a large audience like this one. Professor Megler introduced me, but as I began speaking, a number of the members of the audience began to make noises of various kinds. They would shout or chant, or they had whistles that they had brought with them. And essentially they made too much noise for me to be able to be heard. Professor Megler then invited came back on stage, managed to get them quiet, and invited them to send one of their representatives up on stage to explain why she thought I should not be heard. So somebody came up on stage and quoted some of the things that she had read from me and said, you know, why they were wrong, why they were contrary to the important beliefs like the inviolability of human life. And then Professor Megler said, well, we've heard your reasons. I think in fairness, we should allow Professor Singer to respond to what you've just said. Not to give the talk that I had prepared, but to explain why I thought I should be able to speak. And I did so, and in doing so, I had to explain some basic misconceptions that, in fact, the speaker had had. Firstly, she had assumed, as Professor Grundmann said earlier, that politically I was coming from the right, that I had in some way these neo-Nazi kind of sympathies. She had no idea of my family background and no idea that my parents came to Australia as refugees from the Nazis. But the other issue was that I was able to ask the question whether what was objected to was really the idea of discussing whether some lives were worth living and some were not worth living. And of course that expression is actually pretty tricky here in Germany because it can be translated as Lebensunwertes Leben, the Nazi expression which basically suggested that if you were not Aryan or if you were sort of intellectually disabled or something like that, then your life was not a worthy life in the sense of in which, you know, Aryan lives were supposed to be worthy. It was kind of a blight on the Aryan folk. And I needed to explain that I was not talking about the worth of a life in that sense at all, but rather whether it's a good life for the person living it. And that we do in fact make those decisions. And those decisions were being made in Germany all the time in the intensive care units of major hospitals when they decided not to treat some severely disabled newborns. Or perhaps after deciding to treat them, then when the diagnosis became more clear, for example, that there'd been such a major brain hemorrhage that you could not expect the child ever to understand anything or to walk or to get out of bed, that hospitals then withdrew treatment. And what is this if it's not a decision that it's better that some lives not be lived? And that my difference from this was only in terms of that I thought if you're going to make that decision in some cases, it might be more humane to end the child's life with a lethal injection than to withdraw a respirator and allow the child to slowly suffocate while gasping for breath. So my point was that there are some questions which you might not be comfortable in discussing, but you can't really avoid making decisions, because even the decision to keep all such newborns on a respirator as long as you can is a decision. It's a decision about a quality of life which in fact many people would not agree with. So the question has to be asked, can we make such judgments? On what basis should we make such judgments? Who, excuse me, who should make the decision as to whether we should or should not withdraw life support? And my view was that it was the parents who should make the decision, by the way. I've never defended the view that the state should make that decision rather than the parents or the doctors. So I can see that there is room for different opinions, as Professor Grundmann again said. But I cannot really understand the view that we should not discuss these things. That, for example, we should allow these things to go on quietly in intensive care units in hospitals, but not to have any kind of public discussion of the criteria on which these decisions are made and who should make them. There is one point on which my experiences here in Germany have been somewhat different from the views that John Stuart Mill has in mind and objects to. He says, at one point in part of this discussion about whether an opinion might be useful or harmful, and whether you could decide that irrespective of its truth, he says, "It will not do to say that the heretic may be allowed to maintain the utility or harmlessness of his opinion, though forbidden to maintain its truth. The truth of an opinion is part of its utility." Well, that's correct, I think, if we are talking about matters on which we agree that there is a truth, that truth and falsity applies to that particular issue. But on this question, I think my opponents in Germany originally were divided. Some of them were conservative Christians who thought that the inviolability of human life, the sanctity of human life, is a truth. It's God's law, God's command. And so for them, yes, truth or falsity does apply to this question. But for others on the left, there is no truth in such matters of morality, because they were seeing all of this as really some kind of power struggle. They were seeing the capitalist/fascist state as trying to eliminate, unproductive workers who would be an expense on the state, and they saw themselves as representing the weak and the oppressed, as defending the weak and the oppressed against this authoritarian capitalist kind of state. So the argument that whether my opinions were true or false were not ones that they would accept. They didn't think it applied to these kinds of views. And that view, of course, that critique of morality can be found in Marx, and it can be found earlier than Marx. It can be found notably in Plato's Republic, where Thrasymachus defends the view that what is called justice is simply the interests of the stronger. And I think we should understand Thrasymachus as saying, really there is no such thing as justice. It's just the interests of the stronger pushing on us the conceptions that they want us to believe because it helps them to remain in their position of strength. And today, I think that view has again re-emerged to some extent because of the kind of postmodern deconstructionist views that became popular and still to some extent are popular. But it's quite contrary to Mill's philosophical outlook, so it does require some separate discussion. My objection to this view is that it actually is undermining of the very critiques that people were trying to make. If they were trying to say that I should not be allowed a platform to express my views, then they are making a moral judgment themselves. And if there is no truth in moral judgments, then they can't really defend the claim that I should not be allowed to speak. So on this view, any such claims, including my claim, of course, that I should be allowed to speak, or my claims about that parents ought to be able to make certain decisions, none of these claims are either true or false. But then, what is it that we are doing when we appear to be debating these questions? It seems like we're just trying to persuade, but not persuade of anything that is true, but rather just to get more support for our idea. So really it becomes a kind of a struggle in which there's no particular reason why you should only use arguments and not use force, if force is available, to persuade other people to succeed. And that, of course, is exactly where I think fascism gets going, in using brute force to suppress speech and to create an atmosphere of terror and violence that intimidates the opponents of fascism. And I have to say I find it deeply ironic that some of the people who were trying to silence me at this time describe themselves as Antifa. Thanks for alerting me to where the water was. Okay, so far I've been focusing on views that either are true or may be true. But what about those views that are palpably false? I think it's important to defend the right to free speech here too, partly because of Mill's argument, as I've already said, that you want your views to be a living truth rather than a dead dogma, but also because I think preventing people from speaking is not actually the way to achieve what you want to do if you want people not to believe what it is that they're saying. And I think a good example that we have here is the denial of the Holocaust. It seems to me absolutely, palpably false claim. But I would not have jailed David Irving for his denial of the Holocaust. I presume you're aware of this case. It was the subject of a film called Denial, at least in English, released about 2 years ago, which was about a failed lawsuit that Irving brought against the historian Deborah Lipstadt. But about 10 years ago, if we go further back, Irving served time in an Austrian prison for saying that the Holocaust never happened. The obvious way to convince people that the Holocaust did happen is to present them with some of the overwhelming evidence that it happened. But I can't see that imprisoning someone who denies it is really likely to persuade anyone who is at all inclined to question whether it did happen. It seems to me much more likely to take the opposite effect. That is, that you would ask yourself, why does the state feel it needs to imprison somebody who is saying this? Is it because this person really is onto some dark secret that the state is eager to prevent? I can't see that you're going to convince people in that way. Now, it may be said, of course, that the reason we want to prohibit denial of the Holocaust is not because we want to persuade people that it happened, but because we don't want to offend the survivors and the relatives of survivors who went through such a horrendous experience. Well, it is offensive. And I think I can say that as somebody who lost 3 of my 4 grandparents in the Holocaust, and the 4th managed to survive until liberation, but had to endure terrible years before she did so. I think I can say that it is offensive for someone to say the Holocaust never happened. But I don't accept the defense that what I feel when people say that, or what people may feel when they're offended by things that I say, and I accept that things that I say will cause offense to some people, I don't think that that's a sufficient reason for preventing people saying that the Holocaust never happened, or preventing me from saying the things that I've been saying. I think that offence is really too broad, would lead to too broad a prohibition of speech, because there are so many different things that can offend people in very different ways. And I believe that the benefits of freedom of speech are such that we have to say to people, look, I'm sorry, we can't protect you from all kinds of offence. There's some things that it may be difficult for you, but it's important that we allow freedom of speech, and we'll try and support you, help you in whatever way we can, but we are not going to prohibit people saying things simply on the grounds that they cause offence. And I think this is especially true in philosophy, where we have a tradition that goes back to Socrates, who clearly caused offence when he walked around Athens asking people if they know what justice is, and then when they gave him an answer, showing that actually that answer wouldn't do and they didn't really know what justice is. And we know that Socrates offended powerful Athenians sufficiently for them to condemn him to death by drinking hemlock. But nevertheless, we revere Socrates as being at the head of our tradition, and I don't think we should abandon the idea that we need to question things that people take for granted, even if that may cause offence. Still, you might ask, aren't there some limits to speech that we should not allow, that go too far? Mill thought that there were some limits on freedom of speech. In a famous example, he referred to the view that corn dealers are starvers of the poor. So the corn dealers, the people who are dealing in grain and therefore affecting the price of bread, that they are making profits and in ways and manipulating prices in ways that cause the poor to starve. Mill drew a distinction. He said, if somebody were to publish an article to that effect in a newspaper, that should be permitted. But if someone were to stand in front of an angry mob of poor people outside the house of a corn dealer, it was legitimate for the state to stop that person from stating that corn dealers are the starvers of the poor. Because in those circumstances, that could be seen as an incitement to violence. Now, the parallels that we have here today, I think, are not between whether you publish things in newspapers or whether you give speeches to angry mobs, because there are all sorts of media that can incite people in ways that you don't have to stand in front of an angry mob. But I think it's, in particular, incitement to racial or religious hatred, or to hatred based on grounds of sexual orientation. It's this kind of speech that many countries feel is properly prohibited. And I'm inclined to agree with this view where we really are talking about incitement to hatred, or vilification is another term that is used here. Vilifying someone is heaping all kinds of abuse and scorn and, again, encouraging other people to hate or detest that person. So the distinction I would draw is not exactly the one Mill drew, but it would be about the nature of the speech. I would see vilification that can properly be prohibited as directed to stirring up emotions against minorities or vulnerable people. And particularly, of course, if there is a record of people then using violence against this minority, as there is with minority races and with gays or lesbians or transsexuals as well, and with some particular religious minorities too. So that's, I think, where we ought to draw the line. I don't think we ought to prohibit content, but the way in which the appeal is made. And that's relevant to one of the cases that I mentioned in the beginning, which I want to say a little bit more about, and is a particularly sensitive kind of area. As I said, when Charles Murray went to speak at Middlebury Middlebury College in Vermont, he was shouted down. Now, his claims about race and intelligence are certainly offensive to some people, and people of a particular race, so some people might think that comes into the category of racial vilification. But I disagree. If you read the bell curve, it's actually a pretty wonkish sort of book, if you're familiar with that expression. It's got detailed, complicated discussions of various kinds of evidence that support the thesis that the authors are trying to argue for, that while there's overlapping curves in IQ between African Americans and white Americans, the white curve is slightly more pushed towards the more intelligent side of the curve. And I think you can't really regard that as an appeal to people's emotions. Nobody who picks up that book would say this book is appealing to certain emotions. It may be that it wins support because of biases that people already have. That's possible. But if that's so, then what you ought to be able to do is to show that the evidence is flawed, or that the evidence doesn't support the conclusions that the authors draw. And that seems to me to be the proper response to Murray and to the bell curve. But the students who shouted Murray down and prevented him from making this argument, I think were making a mistake of a somewhat similar kind to the mistake that I mentioned that involved in jailing somebody who denies the Holocaust. They missed an opportunity to show that Murray's evidence is inadequate to support his conclusions or is misleading. What they did when they heard that Murray was being invited was they petitioned the president of the university to have the invitation cancelled. He was invited by a student group, and to override the student group and say they can't invite him. And the president refused to do that. I think what they should have done is asked the president to insist that there be another speaker opposed to Murray's views on the platform and given equal time at that event. And of course, in a university, it shouldn't be hard to find another speaker who is quite expert in the same area that Murray was writing about, and therefore to give that speaker the opportunity to discredit Murray's claims. I think that would be much more convincing to opponents of Murray's views than the essentially silencing of Murray that occurred. Now, after that event, again, still staying at Middlebury, a number of the faculty members published a statement of principles under the heading Free Inquiry on Campus. And the principles included a number of different points, which I'm largely in agreement with. So, for example, genuine higher learning is possible only where free, reasoned, and civil speech and discussion are respected. Only through the contest of clashing viewpoints do we have any hope of replacing mere opinion with knowledge. And a protest that prevents campus speakers from communicating with their audience is a coercive act. Now, the professor's statement prompted a counter-statement by a group of Middlebury students. And the counter-statement, you can find this online if you want to look at it further, the counter-statement is entitled Broken Inquiry on Campus. The counter-statement critiques some of the principles that the professors made and offers an opportunity to examine the thinking of those who did prevent Murray from communicating with the audience who had turned up to hear him. So one passage written in response, that I want to discuss was written in response to the claim of the professors that only through the contest of clashing viewpoints do we have any hope of replacing mere opinion with knowledge. And the students responded, by elevating bigotry and engaging with it in open debate under the misguided view that all ideas must be respected, we risk elevating biased opinions with no solid factual foundation into the realm of knowledge and affirming the unconscious biases many hold. If we hold that the contest of clashing viewpoints is the only way to solidify knowledge, it naturally follows that we have a responsibility to articulate some parameters for which viewpoints are worthy of such a process. But I think you can see that if the students are suggesting we need to suggest some parameters, some limits for which viewpoints are worthy of being part of these clashing viewpoints, then you've got to show that the viewpoints they object to are not worthy. And you've got to get into that debate. So if you want to show that Murray's viewpoints are not worthy, you can't do that a priori by saying, we don't like the conclusions that he's pointing to. You have to say something about the evidence or the inferences drawn from that evidence. So I don't think that that's a way of getting out of the necessity to explain why a view is mistaken. The students have more to say on the matter, but what they say it cuts directly against what I've been arguing are key values for a university. So they say, we contend that experiences and emotions are valid ways to see the world, and that the hegemony of rational, thought-based perspective, often found in a university setting, limits our collective creativity, health, and potential. If we are to move from opinion to knowledge, it's truly imperative to listen, understand, and reflect upon the various lenses members of our community use to view the world. Now, I agree entirely with the last sentence. We do need to listen to different people with different views, and we need to reflect upon what they may tell us. And that's a good reason why it's important to have diverse communities with diversity of opinion and diverse backgrounds. But what I object to here is the claim that emotions are valid ways to see the world, and that we should, and I think that it's also wrong to criticise what they call the hegemony of rational thought. In fact, I would have thought that they would see that once you elevate emotions as valid ways to see the world, then the emotions of racists and sexists and homophobes also become valid ways to see the world. And once again, just as I argued with those who are critical of the idea that there is truth in morality, once again you get back to a kind of conflict in which we are both emoting strongly at each other, but there is no way of settling that kind of dispute other than ultimately by the use of force. Without rational thought, how can we decide which emotions are valid ways of seeing the world and which are not? I need to respond to one other ground that the students give for disrupting Murray's speech. They ask, is it reasonable for students or community members to be asked to debate someone who has presented their intellectual inferiority as an irrefutable fact? That's a reference, of course, to Murray's claim that there is a genetic basis for differences in IQ on average between African Americans and white Americans. But I don't think it's actually true that Murray says this is an irrefutable fact. He does think it's a fact and he presents evidence for it, but I'm reasonably confident that he would say it's imaginable that somebody would present evidence against it or show that the evidence that he has presented for it is mistaken. And the other part about this is that Murray is not making a point about any specific African American and saying that they are inferior to anyone else. In fact, Murray acknowledges very clearly that there are African Americans who are intellectually superior to the overwhelming majority of white Americans. There's no argument about that. He's claiming that there is a small difference on average. As I say, that the bell curves overlap very considerably, but are not completely isomorphic. Still, it's probably troubling for African Americans to hear these arguments. Again, I have no doubt of that, and I think that this is one of those things which nevertheless we need to go through. I don't think it's a reason for not allowing such claims to be discussed in a university. And I want to finish with an example of an African American who took a very different view. In the same year that Charles Murray was prevented from speaking at Middlebury College, Yale University named a new residential college Murray College. Not of course, after Charles Murray, but after Pauli Murray. Born in 1910, Pauli Murray was the granddaughter of a slave. She became a civil rights activist. She spent time in jail during the bus boycotts in the South, the original desegregation protests that were against segregated seating for African Americans and whites on buses in the South. She led sit-ins to desegregate white-only eating places in Washington, D.C. She then went to study law at Howard University in the 1940s. She was the only woman in the class, and all the professors were men. One of them announced to the entire class while she was there that he didn't know why a woman would want to study law. She graduated first in her class and applied to Harvard Law School to do graduate work, only to be turned down by Harvard because the Harvard Law School did not admit women at that time. She went and did her own legal research on segregation, and that research was later drawn upon by the legal team that won the landmark desegregation case, Brown versus the Board of Education, in 1954, which led to the desegregation of schools throughout the American South. Pauli Murray was later a co-founder with Betty Friedan of the National Organization for Women. Why am I mentioning Pauli Murray? Because in 1963, she was studying for a doctorate at Yale Law School, which did admit her, when the Yale Political Union invited George Wallace, the governor of Alabama at the time, to speak on campus. Wallace was an ardent segregationist. In his inaugural speech as governor, Wallace had called for segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And tragically, in the wake of that speech, members of the Ku Klux Klan bombed an African-American church, killing 4 African-American schoolgirls and injuring 22 others. Many blamed Wallace for inciting the violence. By that time, opposing segregation had been Pauli Murray's life work for more than 20 years. She had described segregation as, quote, a monster, dividing peoples, thwarting personalities, breeding civil wars. She said that she would picket any event at which Wallace spoke. Nevertheless, she wrote to the president of Yale University asking him not to withdraw the invitation to Governor Wallace, not to compromise, she said, the tradition of freedom of speech and academic inquiry. Her experience in the civil rights movement had given her a strong sense of the importance of maintaining these rights for everyone. In her letter to the president of Yale, she wrote, "This has been the principle behind the enforcement of the rights of the Little Rock Nine," that's a group in Little Rock, Arkansas, who had been part of the first wave of African Americans admitted to university, of James Meredith, another, and others to attend desegregated schools in the face of a hostile community and threats of violence. It must operate equally, Pauli Murray said, in the case of Governor Wallace. Pauli Murray was an African-American woman living in a climate of racism and sexism that was far more overt than anything that exists today, and she was fully aware of how mistaken and harmful racist and sexist views are. Yet this did not lead her to seek to suppress them, nor did she blind her to the fundamental importance of freedom of thought and expression. I think we should follow Pauli Murray's example in this instance. Thank you.
You spoke a little longer than. He said, I mean, shall we go on for half an hour? So 5 minutes after 9?
Yeah, I thought we could, yeah. Okay, fine.
Okay, we have 30 minutes for discussion. So who wants to start? Yeah, over there.
Is it possible to have the house lights up a little bit, whoever's running the lights, just so that I can better see who's out there? Thank you.
I can
That's
stand
great.
if you like.
No, it's good. Thank you.
In the sphere of academic talks and people being invited to give talks on campuses, what would count as something equivalent to a person giving a speech in front of a corn dealer's house to a group of angry, poor people?
Well, I was trying to suggest that the equivalence here is something that is clearly incitement to hatred or vilification, possibly even violence, towards an already vulnerable group of people, a group of people about whom those attitudes exist in the community already to some extent and can be stirred up. So that's the kind of thing that I think is equivalent to inciting the mob in front of the corn dealer's house. And as I say, I think we need to do that on the basis of the tone, the emotion, the nature of the presentation, rather than the content, rather than whether it is about an issue relating to race, as Murray's work is about that issue.
Yep, over there.
Should work, just hold it close, I think. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Dieter. In Germany, we've got a law called Radikalenerlass, which forbids teachers who are members or supporters of extreme parties to become teachers. So either if you are a member of a communist party or of a Nazi party, you're not allowed to teach. What's your attitude towards that?
Well, I can understand why in the early years after the Second World War, after the defeat of Nazism, you should have brought in a law like that, along with other denazification laws. But I would question whether that law is required today, and I would think that there need to be limits on what people say in the classroom, clearly, and if somebody is a teacher with views that are, political views that are not relevant to the subject they're talking about, they're a chemistry teacher who's a member of a right-wing or left-wing party, then I think they should not be discussing their political views in the class. The more difficult issue would be where somebody is teaching a class in which those political views actually are relevant, where it's a kind of a social studies or politics class. I'm not sure how you name the subjects in which that's discussed. And I think it might be reasonable to say that those classes should not be allocated to people with extreme views, unless you could really have some confidence that they would be not presenting those views as the right views in the class. Now I could think about my own case and my own teaching as a kind of an example, because certainly some people think, Steve Forbes obviously thought, that I have extreme views on issues like abortion and euthanasia within the American political spectrum. Right? If I go to the Netherlands, I don't really have extreme views at all, but if I'm in the United States, maybe I do. So if I simply gave the students my own writings to read and gave lectures in which I defended those views, I think I would not be a good teacher, and I think I should not be hired by Princeton or other universities. I think it's important that students be exposed to a range of views, and so I require them to read articles that take completely different views from mine, and in some cases articles that criticize my views, and I encourage them in their written work to be critical of the views that I take. And often the students who get the best marks are the ones who are critical of the views that I take, because an essay that is simply repeating what I've already said isn't going to be very interesting or original. So I think if you can have those requirements on teaching, then you don't really need to prohibit teaching by people of extreme views. But if you feel that it's not possible to have those requirements, or not possible to enforce them, or the teacher will abuse their role, then possibly you don't want to assign those teachers to classes in which those topics are discussed.
Yeah.
If I understood you correctly, you take somewhat a radical stance towards freedom of speech. They could be rephrased such as, let the evidence speak, so, which I find good. So you would confront a person that denies the existence of the Holocaust by confronting them with the empirical evidence of its existence, with which I'd agree. And now my question, and I have to admit that my knowledge of your text is somewhat outdated, but if I remember correctly, you produced some controversy by the claim that saying, for example, correct me if I'm wrong, disabled persons could be subjected to somewhat, or a euthanasia in terms of the sum of happiness of all persons involved. And I'd now like sort of ask you if you could point to some empirical evidence in terms of studies with which to support that claim.
So the claim firstly, you said disabled persons. Insofar as that discussion was about infants. So let's be totally clear. I have never and never would suggest that anyone who is capable of expressing an opinion as to whether they do or do not wish to go on living should have their life ended unless they specifically request it, right? So that's the first point I think that's important to get clear. So the claim that you were referring to, which I think you're referring to a sentence or two in Practical Ethics, is discussing two different possible views in ethics, one of which is known as the total view and says we should maximize the total amount of happiness in the world that will exist timelessly. And the other view I refer to in that book as the prior existence view. So it basically says we should maximize the happiness of those beings who exist or who will exist independently of something we do. Now, the context in which this discussion comes up is a couple have a child with a serious disability. They've already, let's say, made a decision previously that they want to have a family of a particular size. Let's say they've decided they want to have 2 children. And they've already had 1 child before they had the child with a disability. If the child with a disability dies, they will very probably conceive another child. No fertility problems, so it's very likely that they will want another child. It's very likely they will conceive another child. It's very likely that the other child will not have this disability. So it was on that basis of comparing the family with the child with the disability and the child without the disability that I said, from the total view, right, the view that takes the total happiness, the total sum of happiness would be greater if the child with a disability died and the other child was born and lived that life. So your question about evidence, therefore, comes down to evidence that the life of someone with a disability is likely to contain more happiness than the life of someone without, or that the life of the family, including the parents and the existing child, will be happier if one member of the family does not have a disability than one does. Either of those would be evidence for that claim. Now, it's true that when you look at studies of the happiness of people with disability, even with quite serious disabilities, many people, including myself when I first looked at them, are surprised by the narrowness of the difference in life satisfaction, in their answer to the question, how satisfied are you with your life? Which is usually the way the question is asked. There's slightly different phrasings. although it's narrow, there is still some difference. So if I really want to defend the truth of that statement, I could still say, I think there is such evidence, and I can point you to the studies that show that evidence. But I admit that the evidence is, that the difference is less than you might, or many people might expect it to be. And that shows, I think, human adaptability, if you like, that we adapt to circumstances, we adapt even to quite severe disabilities. It's hard to imagine us without them, but you know, there are studies like this. So somebody has an accident, becomes a paraplegic, they're very depressed for a few months after this, and then gradually, so they're much less happy than they were before, and then gradually they adapt to it, and in most cases, but not all, it rises very close to where they were before, but not absolutely where they were before. So that's the evidence that I would refer to. Let me finally just say, I wasn't taking a stance in this particular thing between the total view and the other view, and the other view actually goes the other way. The other view says, we don't count the happiness of the being who will never exist if this child lives. We only count the happiness of this child. And if this child's disability is not so severe that the child's life will be negative, that is, that the child will prefer to be dead when the child gets to be capable of having such preferences, and that's pretty rare, that's really very rare, then the happiness view on the prior existence view would go in the other direction. Okay?
Hinterwimmer. Can you raise your arm so that, he's the next.
So I wanted to ask, because you brought the issue of truth especially up, so are all claims in principle true or false? Yeah? And I just wanted to ask you, so wouldn't you say that there are certain basic ethical principles that we just have to take for granted, and that it's a valid argument to say abandoning those principles would lead to unacceptable consequences, even if we cannot completely rationally argue for them to be true? And I think there are good reasons to assume that a human's right to live is such a point. And if I look at your own positions and at things that you have said in interviews, so I cannot see how abandoning this principle doesn't lead to extreme and unacceptable consequences in the logic of your own argumentation, even if you do not always draw them in such an extreme form. Yeah? Mm-hmm. I mean, I recall, it was a rather recent interview, I think, that you gave either for Spiegel or Neue Zürcher Zeitung, I can't recall exactly anymore. And there, the interviewer asked whether it would be acceptable, say, because you have this period of 28 days after birth where you would say...
No, I don't actually. I haven't defended the 28 days
but
period
you say
for a long time.
Yeah, you say it's not... It's a reasonable compromise or something like that, right? Or did I get you wrong there?
I put forward that 28-day limit in 1984, and I haven't actually defended it. I specifically said in a later edition of Practical Ethics in 1993 that I no longer held that view, so I haven't held it at least since 1993.
My point is not so much about what you would say in each particular case, but rather opening the debate, let's say, to say that in each single case it's possible to make on certain kinds of evidence a decision whether it's better to save this life, let's say, or end it in certain cases. And I think this... So I cannot see how this cannot lead to morally unacceptable consequences. I mean, and I can see the logic of your argumentation. I mean, if you say there is no principled distinction between human beings and animals, then you have to find some criteria, of course, because you cannot defend the right for each animal for life. That's clear, I think. But I think if we follow the logic of your argumentation, that it's a good reason to say, let's defend this basic principle, that no human being has the right to decide on the life of another human being. Yeah? Because I cannot see, for example, why you wouldn't end up legitimating torturing people. No.
Okay, no, I understand the question.
There was no question, it was just a statement. I think this is possible in such a...
I think, thank you for the statement. I think I understand your viewpoint. So, firstly, I guess a couple of things to say. Firstly, as I tried to make the point, but perhaps rather briefly in what I said, I don't think we can avoid making a life and death decision for some human beings. And my example was the decisions that we make in an intensive care unit for newborn infants whether to put them on a respirator when they're too small, too premature to breathe, and whether to take them off a respirator at some point. And those decisions are being made. I'm sure they're being made in the intensive care unit of this city and of every major intensive care unit in Germany. So we do make the decisions, only we make them in the case of what you might call passive euthanasia, that is withdrawing treatment when the prognosis seems to us very grim, and I hope after consulting with parents and deciding what they want. So I don't really think we can avoid making life and death decisions for other human beings. But the other claim that I would contest is that acknowledging this will somehow lead to very serious moral decline or breakdown of society. I don't think that's true. As I made a brief reference to the Netherlands before. Actually, I was in the Netherlands the last few days. I just came from The Hague this morning. I didn't see any sign of social breakdown in the Netherlands, and yet the Netherlands does allow doctors to make decisions, including, the Netherlands is best known for its voluntary euthanasia, and that's certainly not making a decision for another. But some years ago, doctors at the hospital in Groningen put forward a protocol where they would end the lives of some babies with very severe conditions, in particular very painful conditions, very distressing conditions, again with the consent of the parents. And they announced that they had done so. This has been published. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine as well as in other places. I think it's a very small number of cases where this is actually done, but it is being done, and I don't see, as I said, I don't see any sign of it somehow spilling over into a greater disrespect for life in the Netherlands than, say, here in Germany.
Now, yeah. So first of all, what is the greatest part of the population that is impacted by your approach of not silencing the side that I disagree with and so on? And secondly, why should I care about this part of the population that I'm trying to convince?
I'm sorry, the part of the population that's impacted by my arguments about?
No, the approach of not silencing the other side that I disagree with. So there are the extremists, they will always hold on to their beliefs, and then there are those people who haven't made up their mind, I guess. That's my question.
Right. Well, I think that, as I sort of gave in the example of Charles Murray, I think the impact is on people who might have been convinced that the evidence is not good, but now say, oh, well, why are they trying to silence him? Why aren't they refuting him? So I think there could be an impact on those people who come to believe that his views are true, when very probably they're not true. And yet they don't have that clear discussion and that debate. So it's that kind of thing, I think. Or take James Damore, the Google software engineer. Now, in fact, of course, Google firing him actually gave a lot of publicity to those views. But, that's again an issue which I think ought to be discussed. One ought to look at what sort of evidence there is. Damore was not an expert on this, but he was responding to pressure from Google to hire more female software engineers and so on. So, no doubt there are some people who think, oh, well, what Damore said is probably true, and so women who get hired as software engineers are probably being hired because they're female and because Google wants it to look like there's similar numbers of male and female software engineers, and they're probably not as good as male software engineers. And that may be completely false. We don't know that that's false, but we allow that idea to float around in the sort of social awareness without having had this real sorting out of whether it's right or not.
Hello, you said that offense is not a valid reason to censor speech because it is such a broad and subjective term. My question is, you draw the line at hate speech. Where exactly does it differ from offense?
So I think hate speech differs from merely causing offense in that it has a kind of implicit threat of further harm, right? I mean, you could say you harm somebody when you offend them in one way, but that's a harm that's kind of under their control, to what extent they dwell on it or develop a thicker skin and so on. But obviously, if you incite hatred against some particular group, particularly vulnerable groups where there is this pattern of either discrimination or violence, then they are likely to be harmed in just those ways. They're likely to be harmed in, being fearful that people will beat them up when they go home at night or something like that, or perhaps other forms of intolerance, perhaps being discriminated against when they apply for housing, all of those ways. So I think that's likely to be the effect of hate speech, of vilification, and not likely to be the effect of attempts to lay out evidence and arguments and draw conclusions from that.
Hey, so just talking about the hate speech, I was just wondering what would, in your mind, be the best way to deal with people who actually do a hate speech? Like, let's say, for example, a preacher that tries to convince people to join ISIS. Surely imprisoning them isn't in their interest, but just letting them walk around freely and just doing the hate speech all and over and again and trying to motivate people doesn't help either, right?
No, I think if somebody really is encouraging people to become terrorists, this is a genuine threat, there are terrorists of this group, as say in the case of ISIS, and they do commit crimes, then I think that is itself a crime. And in that situation, I would be prepared to imprison people. I think that that they need to be stopped from recruiting more people who are going to commit crimes. I think that's a right of self-protection that society has.
Thank you very much for your talk. Super interesting, and I somehow on your side with respect to defending free speech by referring to being able to challenge it by taking more evidence into account or new arguments. But what if there are not the resources to acquire more evidence, or the children are too young to figure out what the best argument against it would be? So, or let's consider just a family, and the father is constantly saying to his child, you're stupid, you're stupid. At the beginning, the child might not even be offended or sad because it's used to it somehow. So no emotion involved, but the child doesn't have the resources to argue against it. In such case, take a bigger community where it might be somehow similar, so that one part of the community simply doesn't have the resources to challenge your arguments or your studies. The examples you gave were mainly professors at universities and colleagues with a lot of money to challenge, to work out new experiments, and they have the resources. But what about a community or a group which doesn't have the resources?
So in the family situation, I mean, that's tragic that a parent should say that to a child, but I think actually there's nothing you can do about that. You can't prohibit speech within the family, right? We don't want to have kind of 1984 screens watching everything we do. But in the larger community, I think society has a responsibility to help a minority group develop the resources to oppose those claims. So just as I think we have, societies typically have legal aid for people who are charged with offences and don't have the resources to employ lawyers, but we say they need to be able to have a defence. So I think that societies should assist people, and to some extent I think this does already happen. I can't speak for Germany, but say in Australia we have departments of ethnic affairs which hand out grants to different ethnic minority groups to help them form community organisations, and maybe to give them some money for a community hall or a library or something, and maybe to employ some of the more educated members of that community to help the community with their needs and with empowering the community against some of the problems that they face. So I think there's a social responsibility to help those minority groups to mount a defence of the kinds of criticisms that I'm talking about.
There's the next question for Anne Burkhardt. I think we are running out of time. So.
Thanks a lot. I would like to come back to your suggestion that it's about the form and not the content of speech that is the problem, and that could maybe be used as a criteria when we can silence people. I wondered whether the students that you quoted maybe think that the bell curve, for example, can be used by others later, even if it is presented in an objective, non-emotional manner, then someone else can use it to incite hatred, for example. So I think that often it might be a valuable or it might be a valid worry that this can happen. I mean, of course, I think your suggestion to say we should invite the controversy into universities and try to dismantle wrong claims if they are wrong, that seems to be a good suggestion, but still these ideas kind of float around, and I think people are worried that they might be used by others in an emotional way to incite hatred.
You're right. There is that concern, and it is a legitimate concern, and it does actually happen. So you could go through the American right, I guess, and you could start with people who write these wonkish books like Charles Murray, and then you could just have a spectrum of people who are somewhat more polemical and less evidence-driven than him, and then people who are, again, less evidence-driven still, and then you get to the people at the far extreme who are really engaged in racial vilification and racial hatred. And so it's not easy to draw the line that I was suggesting. And I suppose, if you say, well, how do you draw that line? Ultimately, if you have a law that prohibits racial vilification, then the courts are going to draw that line. And it won't be an easy line to draw. That's not likely to happen in the United States because of the way the courts interpret the First Amendment protecting freedom of expression, but in other countries which don't have the same pretty much absolute protection of freedom of expression, you do have such laws, and you do have courts reaching those decisions. And I agree. It is a problem for my form and content distinction that there's a whole spectrum of content, and somewhere that line has to be drawn.
Okay, you are next.
Okay, so unfortunately for me, I think you might have just answered from over here. The question I was going to ask, which is that different forms of discrimination could be just portraying different groups of people as irrational, egoistic, mocking them, or scorn. So would that apply to any realm of free speech, like stand-up comedy, for instance? So an area that takes very seriously and uses these in different ways, perhaps with different political goals, perhaps just as a joke. Would your restrictions on free speech apply across all contexts, or would that be restricted to explicitly political or academic environments?
I was thinking mostly of political and academic environments. I suppose if you're talking about stand-up comedy, then of course you can mention things and make fun of them, and I think that's legitimate. But if you're actually using the comedy to still incite hatred against those people, if you're addressing, let's say, a overwhelmingly or entirely white audience, and you're making fun of a racial minority who's outside that, and maybe not only just making fun of them in a kind of, you know, tolerant, amused, but maybe somewhat still offensive way, but actually, you know, really ending up painting a picture which leads people to despise them, that could run on the wrong side, I think, conceivably. But you know, I think something like stand-up comedy has looser boundaries and ought to be more is tolerated, but I wouldn't say that, you know, anyone says, I'm a stand-up comic so I can say whatever I like. That doesn't seem right either.
Okay.
During your talk, it didn't really become clear to me what to make of your arguments from a utilitarian point of view. So were you making those arguments because you were arguing that freedom of speech has some intrinsic value, or if not, if you think, well, those arguments should show the utilitarian advantage of having freedom of speech, then why are you relying on arguments rather than evidence? Are you saying it's just maybe too difficult to obtain that evidence and to really know all of the consequences?
Yes, I certainly took myself as making arguments based on the good consequences of allowing free speech, not in terms of the intrinsic value of it. As did John Stuart Mill. Mill says explicitly in On Liberty that he is making arguments from the point of view of what is in the interests of human beings generally, but he says in the interests of humans as enlightened and progressive beings, something like that. And that's his idea, that we hope that we will make progress towards greater knowledge and understanding of a lot of issues, and that freedom of speech is the way to do it. We're perhaps not quite as optimistic as Mill was about making progress. We see things as more complicated, and certainly in terms of progress of the public as a whole towards greater knowledge, some of the things that have emerged in terms of what was going around on Facebook and other social media in regard to the Trump election in the United States or the Brexit referendum don't really encourage us to think that we're actually getting closer to an idea where people have more knowledge and less false opinion. But that is what I was trying to argue, that we're more likely to reach the right conclusions on a number of controversial issues if we listen to each other and try to weigh up the evidence.
I'm very sorry to say that this is the end of the discussion, so let's thank our speaker for his free speech.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Thanks a lot.